that, after all, are driving a great deal of this advertising. So I'm going to ask Joe. I'm going to ask Joe to explain what our first keynote is about and the amazing and novel research that went into this. Joe.
Thank you, Steve. And that was a great setup panel. Thank you for doing that. Can I just ask quickly, like, who's in the room? A quick show of hands. If you're on the brand marketing or agency side, just raise your hand. Okay, and if you're on the media publishing side, and lastly, if you're in the tech solution okay, it's a pretty good mix. Okay, so I'm pretty excited about this interview. I just got to meet Maria earlier this year. She's only been at Havas a little over a year now, but she's had a rich history as a consumer brand marketer. She's been at Mondelez, Colgate-Palmolive, 3M, Hallmark. She's worked everywhere from Kansas City to Paris, where she currently resides as part of Havas Media's elite research team. She's the head of global data and consumer insight, and in that role, she's responsible for both insights, consumer insights, and media effectiveness practice inside Havas Media Group. She's also responsible and oversees this really cool piece of research that I've been tracking for some time called the Meaningful Brand Study. And you came out with your 2015 edition earlier this year. And the neat thing about it, and I'm going to go right into the interview, but you could read all of Maria's credentials on our speaker site, is that I think it's been dealing with the essential question that we're all trying to get at in this industry, but particularly in this room today, about trust and transparency, because it's really about, as I said earlier, connecting the consumer to the brand. I mean, everything else we're doing, an ad, a piece of creative, the media conveyance, the research, the metrics, pre-post testing, all are designed to do one thing, right? I mean, does anybody disagree? It's all about spending a client's budget to win a consumer's attention and get them engaged with their message, and hopefully all those things it's supposed to do. So if that's true, then the essential question is, how meaningful is that brand and everything it does? We're been doing this years, basically study, ask consumers a battery of questions, but essentially the most important one is the indispensability question, which in my opinion is, if this brand went away tomorrow, would you even care? And well, why don't you answer? So what is it?
The number is a bit pathetic. I think sometimes brand marketers are fooling themselves to believe that there's a loving marriage between them and consumers. About 74% of the brands in the world, and this is over 34 countries, over 1,000 brands and 300,000 people, 74% of them could just disappear and nobody would really care. Which is pretty big, pretty shocking, and I think sometimes brand marketers need to hear that because we live inside of our world thinking that we really have established this long-term connection with consumers. So part of what we try to do when we see that there's only that other 26% that have established that meaningful connection, what are they doing right? And what we've learned is, and this is a bit the philosophy of the study, that there are really three key areas in which brands contribute to people's lives. The most important, obviously, is what we call marketplace, the functional benefits. Is the service, is the product delivering what it says it's going to deliver? That's pretty rational, pretty straightforward. The second is personal benefits, and that's more and more important in certain categories. What is the brand doing for me? Funny enough, this year, among all the personal benefits attributes, helping me show off is the biggest one. That might be millennial skewed, I think. And then the third one, and this one is not to be discarded because it talks about transparency, about what the brands are doing for the society, is the collective benefits as a whole. And it's quite important. It almost plays the same role as the personal benefits. For millennials, it's actually more important than personal benefits. And there we're talking about transparency, we're talking about trust, we're talking about ethical behavior that the brand communicates to society as a whole and to their consumers.
So can you drill into that attribute a little bit? I don't know how granular you can get in terms of where it's explicitly about trust and transparency between the brand and the consumer? And if possible, can you give an example of a winning brand that does it really well? It doesn't have to be a Havas brand.
So let me go back to trust first, okay? So we sort of look at meaningful relationships as a virtuous cycle. First, you have to establish trust. That's the prerequisite. If you don't have that, you're not going anywhere. Second is you have to contribute or prove to the consumer that as a brand you are contributing to their lives across those three: marketplace, personal, and collective. And then that creates an attachment to brands, which then cycles through and reinforces trust, okay? So from a trust perspective, globally, we're about 50% of brands are trusted, but North America and Europe are a bit more skeptical. North America is actually the worst. 22% of brands are trusted in North America, so it's quite low. And attachment to brands is, it's pathetic to even say it, 5% attachment to brands in the United States. So very, very low. So if we say, okay, we're at a trust of 22%, not very high, but we need to prove to consumers that we're contributing to their lives across personal and collective benefits. So if we dig a little bit deep into the collective benefits, the most important one is ethical behavior and transparency. And transparency is about being honest about the activities the brand is engaged in, but also communicating them to the consumers. One of the things that was talked about earlier is quite interesting, data privacy. And this trust aspect and how much they're willing to share with brands in the digital space. We did a study last year, we ran in 9 countries on data privacy, and we found that people are very willing, they know, everybody knows, in China, India, Russia, US, everybody knows that their data is being taken. About 85% of consumers are fully aware. Then we clustered customers into what they do about that, whether they're blocking, some people do simple things like, constantly changing their passwords or using several email addresses based on where they're signing up. And then the more advanced is probably the US and the UK. So if you dig into that, they're more willing to provide information to brands that they trust. And those are brands where they're currently consumers, where they're aware of, but they're not consumers, or where they don't even work in that category, but they're very familiar with the brand. So there are certain areas where they're willing and others where they're much more rejecting, if you will, of providing their data.
Yeah, when we trust a brand, certain brands, we give data that's more powerful than our digital footprint. We give them our health records, our financial data. It's because we trust those brands. We don't always do that digitally, but when consumers trust and love their brands, they feel like they're an important part of their lives. They give to those brands data and behaviors because they want things back, right?
Exactly. And there are certain categories where they're much more trusting because they see the end benefit for them. Curiously enough, the healthcare category came across in all of the countries as the category they're more willing to trust and give information to because they can see the end benefit for themselves. Consumer products scored very well as well. Not surprisingly, banking and insurance, no way. They don't want to give any data in that category. If I go back to your question about what brands are most trusted, again, it's about making sure that they meet the expectations that consumers have in those 3: functional, personal, and collective. Honda scores very, very well. It's not the biggest automotive, but definitely the most trusted among the brands that we looked at. Samsung does really well too. And Samsung does something that perhaps Apple doesn't do so well, is that they provide a proper balance of the collective benefits. They do a good job of contributing to local communities. Consumers in every country are aware of what they're doing for society as a whole in their countries, not just in Silicon Valley, Apple style. So they score very, very well from a trusting standpoint as well.
So I want to go back to that differential between the U.S. and the rest of the world, because I think there's a telling statistic in there. So let me ask you, why is the U.S. proportionately lower in terms of brands mattering and attaching to brands?
Okay, and Europe is also low, and I think the way to answer that question is to look at what happened in Latin America, because many years ago, the trust levels, the attachment levels in Latin America were extremely high, in the 80-90% ratios, and over the last 10 years, we've seen an evolution as and you and I talked about this, there's too many brands out there. So as we see more and more brands entering the market, and instead of 5 orange juice choices, you have 25 orange juice choices, the attachment to brands is smaller and smaller and smaller. And I think we have that issue in Europe and in North America. There's just too much out there, and people are finding it difficult to truly engage in the long term with brands.
That's a paradox of choice. So when I started working for the network, 4,000 brands because satellite had come. Today, the number I can put against that is Google and Facebook's global advertiser base, and it's over 3 million. And the reason I actually thought of that progression when I was talking to the ANA, they were thinking of doing some research for the year ahead, and I had come fresh off of Havas's Meaningful Brand Study, and I was trying to think about this paradox of choice, and the fact that the real issue here probably isn't technology so much as it is that people have too much crap to choose from, and they want better ways of filtering it.
But we have the same issue with the study. We're preparing now the wave of the study this year, and there's just too many brands on the list. And every country wants to make sure we include their top 20 brands in every category. It's just impossible. Otherwise, the thing would blow beyond 5,000 brands. We have too much crap on our list.
So it's ironic. And so brands are competing against, look, it's only going to get worse, right? It's only going to grow. What does a brand mean? A brand was literally a way to tell a consumer, I mean, it started by branding cattle, right? You know, separating and differentiating that stock from that stock. And it was a way to tell and shortcut to the consumer, like, that's what we represent. But now they have so much choice, they don't even know what half of the brands mean. And then more importantly, they don't trust a lot of them. So what is it that differentiates the trusted brands from all the other brands that the consumers lean into?
Okay, so there are two pieces to answer that question. The first is, to differentiate, you really have to deliver on the expectations they have on personal benefits and collective. For the most part, most brands do what they say they're going to do from a functional standpoint. But where you really can make a difference is if in a certain category, and again, it's not the same across different industries, if in a certain category helping me show off, millennial or not millennial, is important, then the brand needs to find a way to market the consumer instead of itself through its brand. If in another category, being ethical or providing a good workplace or contributing to the economy is important, then your brand needs to communicate that message to the consumer target that they have. Once that trust is established and reinforced, this might seem obvious, but it's important to note that any KPI performance for trustworthy brands is sometimes 10 times higher than it is for brands that are not so trusted. And that includes advocacy and sharing information about that brand, which is earned media is more and more an important part of how brands get through awareness and get through purchase.
So one of the challenges for consumers that's manifesting in all of this tune out of brands is that they don't have enough time to process all of the options that are available to them. Yet what are brands doing? They're taking time away from consumers. They're taking time by serving, by Nielsen's count now, 5,000 impressions a day. So consumers have entered into an arms race with brands and publishers by adopting technology that filters out and blocks it. So I'm just wondering, I know you didn't look at this specifically in your study, but what does your gut tell you about consumers who become aware of brands using technology to hijack their attention or circumvent their control over the experience?
I think we're walking a fine line, and you all mentioned it earlier in the panel this morning, but it's about identifying what categories they're interested in and not bombarding them with stuff that at this particular moment in their lives or through the customer decision journey, they're not there yet. I don't know how to do that, at least not from an insights point. It's more an analytical question, but just it's about the right time in the right place and not bothering them with categories that they're not currently searching out right now.
So let me ask you a related question, which is the big data issue. Consumers, I think you even might have said it, that they're aware now that their data is being scraped and gathered at, like you said, 85%?
85%, yeah.
Okay. So how do they feel about that? And is that affecting the trust that they have, knowing that they're being tracked all the time, that everything they do is being used, not necessarily against them, but without their knowledge or will?
Okay, so we come to the transparency question. So in that study that we ran in 9 countries, and they said, I'm aware that my data is being taken. I would like the brand to notify me, as long as they're using if they're following regulatory requirements and they're being ethical, I'd love for the brand to just let me know they're taking my data and give me a general understanding of what they're using it for. I'd like to know whether they're using anonymously or my specific information. And then very smartly, a lot of countries said, if they pay me for it, I'll give them even more. That came across as well in some of the countries. But it's a question of transparency. Tell me what you're using it for, tell me you're taking it, and then you're already moving to a different level of trust with your customers.
Yeah, the pay me is interesting because advertising was always a value exchange. Originally, it existed because of a scarce information economy, right? You didn't have that many media choices. Today, you have an infinite number of media choices, so the value exchange may need to be a little more explicit. But let me ask you to drill a little more deeper in the data gathering aspect of this, which is, to me, it's really about control and the reason why consumers are adopting ad blocker technologies. By the way, I didn't raise my hand, but I've been using ad blockers since I was born, literally. I mean, it's called turning your head, right? I mean, the DVR, the remote control, all of these things are just technologies that have been evolving over time to give the consumer the control over who and what they want to look at. And ad blockers are the same thing. There's a professor at the Annenberg School, Joe Turro, who's a leading proponent of privacy. And in his studies and research, he says the number one attribute for consumers is not privacy. He doesn't even think it's control. He uses the word dignity. He feels like people just feel like they've lost their dignity. And I'm just wondering, I didn't prep you for that question, but what do you think? I mean, do you think that this is really more a very emotional issue for a lot of people? Like they feel like their rights have been taken away from them?
If I look at that study we did on data privacy in the 9 countries, again, the attitudes are different. In certain countries, people have known for a really long time that before the internet, the government was taking their data. So there's a different level of acceptance, if you will, in other markets versus the US. But I think it's about respect. Maybe that's linked to dignity. If the brand tells me what they're doing with my stuff, if they're only going to hold it for 6 months and they tell me after 6 months that expires, then it's a two-way communication, and myself as a consumer and the brand are at the same level. So it's a mix of dignity and respect for me vis-a-vis the consumer.
How much do you think the gatekeeping function is becoming an issue here, that consumers are aware of the fact that they're being gated, and that, well, I mean, with the Forbes example, we now have a literal example. If you show up with blocker software installed and you don't allow it to be turned off, you're not going to access that content. People are becoming more and more cognizant. Apple has a patent they own that if you don't look at it, they've never used it, but they own this patent that if you don't look at their ads, they will shut down your OS, literally. And that could be on your phone, your computer, or whatever. So that's the technological level we exist in today, whether you use it or not. So really my question is, do you think consumers want to have more control over the gatekeeping function of whether they even are in the market to look at the ad or not for a brand?
That's a loaded question. I don't think there's a full-out 100% rejection. And again, this market by market, because it's not the same in the US versus the UK versus India, China, Mexico. I don't think there's a 100% out rejection of the ads. I just think that if you have a better understanding of your consumer and you come to them with the right information in the right place, and they know why you're taking their data, because there's some sort of, it doesn't have to be cash, but some sort of reward incentive, understanding for them what their personal and collective benefit is at the end of the day, then the level of respect is established, and I don't think you'll have a problem. But getting to that holy grail is very, very challenging today.
Yeah, my personal favorite example of consumers giving data to a brand is in the pharmaceutical category. Now, consumers think, well, it's regulated in the US, the FDA, and other countries, other regulatory bodies, so that's some safety. But I think the real reason is that if the consumer doesn't give that data to the brand can't help them. They can't fix their ailment.
Exactly. That's why health insurance. That's why health insurance. I mean, health was the one category that came out where people were most willing to provide their data because they understand the end benefit for themselves.
Okay, so I'm going to turn over to questions from the audience. I think we have about 5 or 10 minutes, but before we get to that, I just want to ask one more question of Maria, because I want to know if there's any insight there where brands could leverage the propensity of a consumer to want to, not to avoid their ads, but to actually want and seek them out. Back when I joined MediaPost, we happened to be doing some consumer research, and it was sponsored by CBS, and it was about DVRs. And, you know, I was walking into MediaPost. I really wasn't sure what the survey was about, but I had this thought. I wanted to know, we all talk about consumers avoiding ads, but do people ever use technology to seek ads out? So we actually asked consumers, it was self-reported, whether they ever use their DVR to record, rewind, or store commercials. And it was small. It was about 4 or 5%. But I thought that was fascinating that people actually are cognizant of the fact that they use technology to save or preserve or access advertising. So it's not always a negative. And I was really curious about when and how brands could actually make that more, use technology to create better access to their ads, not to block it. And I was wondering if you've thought about that at all. What would enable consumers to seek out brands' messages?
We've done some research on millennials recently, and they seem to be a generation that is a bit more extremist on both ends. If they really don't like a brand, they will propagate bad messages about the brand all over the world, but they also believe that they are a voice to advocate for a brand when they fall in love with a brand. So it's harder to get them hooked, but once they're hooked, they're much more loyal, and they will be your earned media power. So I think with that particular generation, there is an opportunity to engage them with significant content. And again, if you find a way for the brand to be their vehicle of advertising for themselves, you've got, the winning ticket.
Okay, any questions from Maria about brands or connecting consumers, technology? Does she have an ad blocker? Do you use an ad blocker?
No, I just turned my head.
Yeah.
Maria, do we know anything about whether it matters that corporations have a personal face? Does it make a difference that we know Tim Cook leads Apple, or we knew that Steve Jobs led Apple, or that we know that Rupert Murdoch is at the head of News Corp? Does that level of personalization of a company have anything to do or have any benefit when it comes to trust and loyalty?
We haven't studied that as a global level. I think probably in the U.S., given that a lot of the corporations you mentioned, well, other than the Australian, in the U.S., again, this is a bubble here. We're not talking about the average consumer, the people sitting in this room. So you're much more aware of the leading heads of major corporations at a global scale, and I'm running all the way from Peru to the Philippines. I think that has less of an impact than we might think across all categories. I'm sure there are exceptions, like Apple, for instance. But globally speaking, I don't think, we haven't studied it, but my gut says that there really isn't as big of an impact as we would expect.
Can I ask one more question? Do we have time?
Yeah.
So it was alluded in the last panel at the end, and we have a panel coming up on it, but I want to ask you about native or non-transparent advertising or brand messages. Content marketing is the big push now, and it seems like the best practice in the industry is like the less apparent that it's an ad, the better it is, although the FTC has just reminded us in this country that's actually against the law. So I'm just wondering if you've started to probe into that, like what is the potential backlash of consumers in terms of trust when they can't even tell that the brand's message is an ad?
We haven't started, but this year we will. In the study that we're going to run this year, we're going to do a deep dive into content and what kinds of content are rejected by consumers or accepted by consumers. So hopefully in the fourth quarter, we'll be talking about that point.
Just your gut. How important is it that it's disclosed that it's being brought to you by the brand versus non-transparent?
Honestly, Joe, I'm not sure.
Okay.
Again, it might be a generational question. If I split my segment out of 300,000 people by generation, I might have different responses to that. But there is one personal benefit that stands out very often, which is about making me happier and entertaining me. So if I take that view of it, then absolutely. It's not so much about the brand, it's just about providing entertaining content that makes me laugh or makes me happy.
Okay, well now you have to come back next year to show us the results of those. So thank you, Maria.
Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you, Maria. We're going to take about a 15-minute coffee break, but when we come back, we're going to talk about the relationship between agency and we're going to drill